Part of understanding the fundamentals of animation is understanding how deformation of an object works towards creating the illusion of properly moving and colliding one object with another. So the bouncing ball exercise demonstrates weight, arc, timing, and deformation all in one fairly simple, straightforward exercise. So this is why it's such a tried and true method of beginning the deformation animation process. And that's not just true with three-dimensional animation, but this began long before the advent of 3D animation in the form of computers and computer software, with the process of doing this on paper for 2D animation, and then also for claymation, but primarily for 2D animation, hand-drawn animation. So it starts with going into Modeler and building a ball. So we're going to create a ball, the ball tool, and starting in the top view, extruding it, and I want a fairly even ball and it should be centered. So I'm going to go ahead and just eyeball this and go by hand. Hit the return key to make it. I'm going to go to the surface setter to smooth it out. I'll make it double-sided even though it doesn't have to be, but I think that's not a bad place to start. And let's go ahead and give this surface a name. Let's go to the surface tool, change surface, and we'll call this ball. Give it a red color. Smoothing activated. There we go. Alright, and just to make sure it's centered, I'll go to Modify Center, Center All. And just want to see where, there it is, Center All. And with that, we're ready to move on to the next part of the model. In layer 2, I want to go ahead and put a room. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And we'll make a box, but I'm going to put the foreground layer in the background so I can see the size of the ball as I do this. So I go to Create tab, choose the box tool, make a nice big floor for my room, and give it some walls. Zoom out a little bit more, make it even bigger. Plenty of space. Great. Alright, that'll do it. Hit the return key. Let's go ahead and change the surface. We'll call this room. And let's give it a different color. I'll go with blue. I'm going to go to the surface editor, make it double-sided. And now I can go ahead and start to take this apart. So I'm going to polygon edit mode and just delete out these polygons here with a small delete key. And now I'm ready to go ahead and get to work. So with this created, I can save this object as, and go to here, just choose Save Object As, and we'll just call this Walls with Ball. And we'll put that on the desktop, save it, send it over to Layout, and there we go. First thing we need to do is adjust the scale. We notice that the camera and light are too big for this object, so we're going to go ahead and just adjust the grid square size to clarify that. And we'll just do that quickly. Here we go. That looks about right. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit from there. And let's get the camera closer. And zoom in to that. The grid square size is a little off. I'm going to go ahead and just, there we go. Let's make this a double vertical window, and we'll go ahead and set up the camera view here at the T key to move it, so I can just go ahead and put the camera into place. And I'm going to lower this a little bit, get closer to the room, something like that. Alright, now I'm not going to set up the lighting just yet. I'll put this over to the side, just get it out of the way. We're going to start with the ball, and what we're going to do, we've got 120 frames here on the timeline. We're going to move the ball at 0. We're going to move it up and to the left. Again, I'm using my camera view to reference this. Every 20 frames will create a change. So I'm going to go ahead and have this hit the floor at 20 and over to the right. Then at 40, I'm going to have it go up and to the right. Fairly evenly. At 60, down to the floor. Doesn't have to be perfectly hit it making contact, just do your best. And then at 80, come back up, a little bit less this time. And then 100. And then a little over to the right. And then 120, we'll leave it up in the air. Again, a little bit lower this time. So we've got every 20 frames we have a change in the direction. So if we hit play, this is what it looks like. The ball's kind of floating through space. So this would be a flight path similar to what we saw with the spaceships on the space scene. So while this is great for a floating ball, it's not so great for a bouncing ball. So what we want to do is create the illusion of weight. And we do that through arcs. So I open up the graph editor. And with the graph editor, we can see exactly the trajectory of the ball. And you'll notice specifically this wavy sort of action here on the Y is really creating that illusion. So what we want to do is we want to create a more U-shaped or arc-shaped trajectory. So to do that, I'm going to hold down my right mouse button and just lasso all of these keyframes on the top, just by dragging out this rectangle. By selecting all 4 of these, I can now come down here to my curve and start making adjustments. So I'm going to go to the right on my tension, and then continuity, the same thing, till I get to 1, that's the maximum. Leave the bias at 0, and then we're going to come down and right-click on the bottom 3. And for that, I'm going to go use negative numbers, -1 on the tension and -1 on the continuity. And that gives me these nice little arc shapes. And with that in place, I can then take a look at the trajectory on the different axes. Here is the X trajectory, the X position. Just move this, make it a little bit bigger, and move this over so you can read that. There's the X, which is red. And you can see it's fairly even. I've done a pretty good job of spacing these, but if I want to just tweak this a little bit to make it even more even, the more continuous this diagonal line is, then the more even that is. That shows me a nice even trajectory for the ball. And then on the Z, it should be flat because we're not moving it closer or further away from the camera. So all you're going to see is just a continuous diagonal on the red, showing its trajectory from left to right, and then the most intricate work, of course, on the Y. We haven't done any rotation, so that's not going to happen. But if we hit play now, you'll notice that the ball starts to follow these arcs, which gives it a very different sense of timing. What is it doing exactly? Well, when we created these arcs, we generated more frames at the top of the arcs and less frames at the bottom, which emulates the illusion of the look of gravity, which is to make the ball accelerate the closer it gets to the Earth, as opposed to when it's fighting gravity and gravity starts to win the battle. It just takes a slightly longer time as it floats up there at the air at the top of the arc than it does at the bottom, and that again helps to create the illusion of a bounce the way we're used to seeing it, because this more clearly replicates the natural world that we're used to seeing, where the ball doesn't move fluidly and evenly across the board, but it moves unevenly. We have an acceleration at the bottom and a slowdown at the top. The trajectory of the arc also coincides with what we'd expect from the natural world. All right then, so what we're going to do next is to add deformation to the process. Deformation is when we deform an object to create the illusion of stretch and squash. Stretch and squash as it applied to the bouncing ball, is going to work in two different directions, but it will create the illusion of cartoon exaggeration of a more rubbery, more pliable type of ball. So if this were a real ball, unless it were some type of, I don't know, magical water balloon, it's probably not going to deform all that much. But in the cartoon world, we like to exaggerate things, like to go things a little heavier. So when we go to the Modify tab, I'm going to go ahead and access from the transform, we're going to use the squash tool. And I'm just using the green handle, which will squash on the Y. You notice it gets nice and flat when I do that, which gives me a lot of cartoon exaggeration. Next up, I'm going to go to the top and stretch it out the other way along the Y-axis, once again using the squash tool. So I'm going to keep doing this throughout its motion path, using this cartoon exaggeration. To add that stretch and squash in there. Now this gives it a much more pliable feel, but you'll notice it's a little bit odd as well because it's deforming before it hits the ground, which destroys the illusion of the impact causing the deformation. So in other words, when I come and look at this, you see it starts to deform way before it hits the ground. So what we can do is add another keyframe right before 20, before all of these impacts, and just go ahead and counteract that deformation. So that would not be necessary on the top of the arc, but only on the bottom. So 59 will do the same thing, and at 99 for me as well. Now, in adding these additional keyframes, you notice it tweaked the arc, and it no longer has that nice smooth feel that it had before. So we can fix that once again in the graph editor. You notice the arcs look lopsided now. So I'm going to select on the Y, and let's go in and just do a little tweaking here to fix that up. So I'm going to select each point at the top, and I'm just going to do a little bit of modification to try and get that to work. So let's try now the next one at the bottom. And I'm just doing this by eye to get the arc visibly, noticeably better, I hope. And then this point here at the bottom, looking better. This point. See, I'm just trying to bring back that perfect uniform U shape. Now we've got the arcs back the way they were. The ball is deforming only on impact. And so the cartoon exaggeration and the stretch and squash is starting to come to life. Again, you should always preview to get the actual speed of your animation. Otherwise, you run the risk of being surprised when you actually do your render. And there's our stretch and squash. There's our deformation animation. So this is kind of the end of our rite of passage for the bouncing ball exercise. It's told you it's fairly simple, it's fairly straightforward, but it does hopefully done a good job of explaining to you or getting you to think about deformation, the process of motion. And if you'd like to render this out and see the results, by all means do so. But don't forget, lighting is always a good idea to get in the habit of proper lighting. So just as a quick reminder, I'll throw a little bonus in here and light this for you. So if we go to light properties, the first thing we do with the 3-point lighting setup is to set up an edge light or a backlight, which if you've watched that tutorial, that we like to use distant for that. It works very well. But we want to turn off the light effect that it would have on the background. So it would only light the ball, not the walls. So that would exclude layer 2 in that case. And when it comes to the light color, we might choose something a little bit warmer. remember the edge light or the backlight should be very bright and intense. So I'm going to set this to 800. Now it's lighting too much of the ball. So what I should do is hit the Y for rotate on that light. And what I can do in rotating the light, let me just target it. I've got two camera views. I'm going to put this to perspective. Let me target that light so I can see what's going on. And I'm looking in my camera view over here to get a nice crescent shape. Something like that, almost like an eclipse. That should do the job. And now we're ready to add our main light that will create the shadows for the scene. So let's go ahead and do that next. I'll zoom out a little bit here. So I'm going to add another light. I'm going to go to the Items tab and choose Lights. And for this one, you can choose a variety of options. There's a variety of choices you can make. You can go with an area light. You can try a spotlight. This will be your key light, though, that's creating the shadows. So you want something that creates very attractive looking shadows. A dome light would also work because it's an infinite light source. Let's try the dome light. So I'm going to call this the key light. And remember, like the distant light, this is an infinite light source. It's just a question of finding the angle of rotation that best suits the scene. So for the properties, I'm going to increase the intensity up a bit so it's a little brighter. And then I'm going to rotate it so I get the positioning the way I like it. I'm also going to put this in VPR mode so I can look at my shadows to see what kind of shadows I'm going to get. The angle, I'm going to go more focused, so I'm going to try something like 15, like a lower number. And if that's still too high, maybe like a 7. There's the shadow being cast, but I want it on the floor, and I'm getting it on the wall, as you can see there. So let me just zoom out a little bit and go up higher so I can see the light. All right, so let's just rotate this so that the shadow is on the floor where I want it, and perhaps also get a better result on the ball. All right, let's see how that's going to look as we progress forward. The shadow looks good, but the problem I'm seeing is that as the scene progresses, it goes forward, all we're really getting in terms of light on the ball is the light that we receive from the backlight. So if that's the case, it's probably not going to look all that great from this perspective. So why don't I try and add a third light to give it a little bit of fill. So with this light, I will go to Items, Add Lights. Let's go with a point light. I'll call this Fill. And this point light, I want to go ahead and just take the animation out of that. Let's take that off at 0. I'm going to go ahead and move this light up a bit. Alright, that'll give you a nice fill for this room. So it's lighting the room, it's lighting the ball, but I still have my edge there, my edge light, and we still have my shadows where I want them on the floor. The problem is this creating shadows of its own, and I don't like those shadows. So what I'm going to do is go to Properties and just turn off those shadows. Just turn off the shadows created by that new light. So it's only filling that in. And that's a good thing for fill lights if you don't want the shadows that they create. It shouldn't take too long to render. At that point, if you want to do a quick review, I can go to Camera Properties. Just make sure that the settings are okay. HDTV. You can turn on motion blur for your render if you want to test it out. For speed purposes, I'll leave mine off. And then I'll go ahead and just give it a name. Ball bounce, save it to the desktop. And QuickTime.move. render that scene under the Render tab. So you can see it's averaging about a second per frame. So I've only got 120 frames, so in 2 minutes it'll be done. So once again, this is a great place to start to sort of understand how you can implement deformation into your characters. So in terms of the ball, yes, it's a very simple shape, and so deforming it was easy. But when you have a more elaborate character, you can still apply the same thought process in terms of arc, in terms of weight, in terms of the stretching and the squashing. All that kind of exaggeration really embellishes the cartoon look of your animation. The more stretch and squash you add to your characters, the more cartoony things become, the more animated they feel. Also, it's just going to create a smoothness and a fluidity to the work that you produce. So think about that as you go forward in animation with all of the different types of characters and objects you might be moving. Always think in terms of cartoon exaggeration and what kind of role that might play on what it is you're animating. How much stretch and squash do you want to implement, and exactly how will that affect the overall timing of your pose-to-pose animation? So if you can come to terms with these concepts here with a simple project like this, it'll definitely serve you well as you go forward with more complex projects and more complicated characters that have multiple body parts and such. The situations might get more complicated, but the principles are still the same. We're almost there. It's just about done rendering. We can take a quick look when this is done. So I didn't have any anti-aliasing, so it's going to look rather rough, but nonetheless, let's take a look at what we got in terms of the motion. Just open up this file. There it is. I'm going to size it down so you can see it better. And there you go. Stretch and squash, the arcs, the bounce, it's all in there. Again, this could be smoothed out with a higher quality render, but not bad. Alright, I'll leave it there, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.